loving me, I loving you. Mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, sisters and brothers, friends for life, won't live in the past. All I wanna do now is making it last. Mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, friends forever, strengthening the ties that keep us together. Mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, friends forever, strengthening the ties that keep us together.
We're here again for another conversation with my friend Eva Forde, my social worker friend.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome, Eva.
Thank you, Noreen. Welcome, Noreen.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And this is Making It Last. It's all about where we try to help people to better their relationships. And this time around, Eva, we're going to be talking about an issue that really hits close to home. Mm-hmm. Some people might say, yes, but you're not a parent, so you can't relate maybe to some of the things we'll talk about. But I have had good parents, I believe. So I believe I can speak somewhat on this issue. Recently, here in Jamaica, there's been a lot of talk about corporal punishment. We've seen different things happening in the news in terms of how some parents have actually disciplined their children. Yes, to some people, those instances might have been to the extreme. But I believe that we have a responsibility to help those listening to ensure that they don't get to that point. Now, before we started this podcast, we were talking a little bit about a little of the rights of children and the whole idea of, so I want you to just mention a little bit of that to give some more of a context. Something with the Human Rights Children Convention. Just tell me, right? Just tell me a little bit about that. That was
All
before
right.
we actually started recording.
Right, before we started recording, I was just mentioning that here in Jamaica, we follow the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the Child Care and Protection Act here. Okay. So those are the primary documents that guide our philosophy, the philosophy that we as Jamaica, a country, has agreed should be practiced in terms of how we relate to children.
Okay.
So things like, children have rights. Things like children should be respected. Children also have responsibilities. Children should be cared for and nurtured. They should have proper nutrition. They should be allowed to go to school, all of those things. So, when we talk about parenting and positive parenting, we're talking about it not just from the perspective of the parent, but also in relation to the child and the child's role in being a child of a parent. So, and I mentioned before, you were asking me about, or we were talking about discipline, I think. And what I was saying is it really depends. It depends on the age of the child. It depends on your child's personality. Okay. It depends on the context in which the discipline is being carried out. So there are many, many factors to be considered when you're talking about parenting and respecting children, as well as children needing to also recognize their role and respect parents and their authority.
Which is a nice segue into what the question we want to answer, because every podcast we ask a question, and the idea is that hopefully at the end people are able to get an answer. And today the question is, how can I be a better parent? Now, yes, it is vague, but we're specifically focusing on in terms of how one disciplines his or her child. Now, you alluded to it just now, but you said it depends on the kind of child or the type of child that one has. Speak a little bit more about that.
So actually, I want to back up and say that, our listeners will always hear me put responsibility first and foremost on you, the person, you, the listener, whether
Good.
you're a parent,
Good.
whether you are a spouse, whether or not we're talking in the context of parenting. I think it's really important that you, the listener, accepts that your responses have nothing to do with who is on the other side. I shouldn't say have nothing to do, but they have little to do with who's on the other side of the discussion or the discipline or the conversation. So make sure, I usually say, check yourself, right? So when we're talking about discipline, right? Before we get there, look at yourself as a parent and consider what's going on for you. Because many times, and I would say, not just in the Jamaican society, but absolutely, I think it may be exaggerated a little in Caribbean society. Many times when discipline is handed out, it's handed out from an extremely emotional place of the punisher. So already, that's a challenge. So punishers, that's why I say check yourself.
Yes.
What's going on for you?
Yes.
Have you eaten? Are you
Deal with the basics.
Are you
Yes.
deal with the basics? Are you stressed? Did someone, is your boss, getting on you at work? Like, make sure you check yourself first. And it's important then to consider number one, consider your child. Like, who is this child? And what's the mental reasoning capacity of this child? I saw someone the other day. I don't know if the child was 2 years old, and there was a mother who was obviously very frustrated with this child, and she was talking to this child and relating to this child as if this child were, a teenager, and saying, "Cha, stop crying, man, cha." And getting very upset and irate. And the 2-year-old child is just looking up at the mother crying, obviously kind of saying like, just accept me or hold me, or I'm tired of walking, or I'm scared, whatever the child was trying to relate to the mother. The mother was being extremely, I'll say, her response to the child was inappropriate based on the child's age, because it was too harsh. There was absolutely no understanding on the part of this parent of what was happening for the child and what that child needed. And so back to the original question, when it relates to discipline and disciplining the child, you have to consider all of those factors. What's going on for the kid? If the child is of a reasoning age, so that the child is knowingly behaving outside of the context of which you have, or outside of the parameters of what you have agreed upon is acceptable, then, again, consider, did this child actually know what they were doing? What were their influences? There's so many things that you need to consider. You also need to understand, let's assume that you as a parent, you've checked yourself. Then looking at the child knowingly did something that was inappropriate, or that went against what you agreed upon was appropriate. Then your discipline needs to be tempered and measured to what that child actually did. Okay. So you wouldn't just say, okay, you're on punishment, just, indefinitely. You've got to give some context to that child. You're not just going to, I know for some people who still beat their children, although in Jamaica, that's not something that we support anymore. on the books, it's not something that we support. On the books, you'll talk to people outside and they'll say, yes, beat him, yes. And these are childcare workers, police officers, but we still have that in our system. Yeah. So you're not going to, when I say beat the child, I mean like kill the child. Like you're not going to, punch them, box them. Like that's unacceptable. Like we don't do that.
Do you think there is room for any change for that though, because Jamaicans have always had the mindset that, you don't spare the rod and spoil the child. So do you think that we can get to a point where we will actually move away from doing that and find, appropriate ways of disciplining?
I mean, we've started.
children.
We've absolutely.
started.
Oh, absolutely. We've
Good.
started years ago. We've started, but I think old habits die hard. I don't know if we'll ever get there before the second coming, but I think with each generation, you teach the children
Good.
appropriate ways of behavior and discipline, and so you hope that they then, as they grow, model what they learn is right, as opposed to what happens in the home if what happens in the home is not healthy. Yeah. So, but it's happening, and it can change. Yeah, it can.
So, just as we're wrapping up, Eva, help me understand something. It's a combination of educating, not just parent in terms of, so yes, we want to answer the question, how can I be a better parent? But in being a better parent, we also have to help to educate our children. Am I correct?
Absolutely, because eventually many of our children will be parents themselves. So you always want the next generation to do better if they know better. So I think that's what we're trying to do as a society now. We're trying to not only educate the children, because we are going into schools and going into communities and educating the next generation, but it's also important to talk to parents now about better ways to discipline their children as well. And again, I always start with, check yourself. Get help for yourself. Many parents are damaged from the parenting that they received. They don't acknowledge it. They may not know it. But if parents can get help and support for the unresolved issues that they have from how they were raised, then we expect to see the change in the way that they parent their children.
Okay, so as we wrap up, you mentioned the first one. So if I'm answering this question, how can I be a better parent, specifically in terms of how I discipline my child? I need to make sure I check myself. Yes? Check yourself.
Yes.
I must-
and let me give you some tools to check yourself.
Okay.
Because that may be a bit vague.
Okay.
Check yourself means, so I'm very fortunate because I have several friends in the helping profession, in the behavioral sciences. So I check myself by going to them and asking them, hey, I'm having this problem. I'm having this challenge. I feel this anger towards my child, or I feel this frustration, or I feel whatever. Can you help me? Help me process this. Help me understand what's happening, because I feel like I may say something that may hurt my child, or I feel like I may do some damage. And that's not really my ultimate goal. My ultimate goal is to show my child I love them. However, this has me angered and frustrated. So get some support for yourself, whether it's a friend who can tell you the truth, or it may be professional counseling. You may need some therapy, but get some support for yourself. And it's a process. It's not just a one-off thing. It's something that you may have to get on an ongoing basis.
Okay. Another thing you mentioned too is that you must consider the child, specifically with their age level, their emotional level, their reasoning ability. Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and again, let me speak on that. So, child development is a huge thing. There's a lot that goes into a child's development, and a lot of parents don't know this. So pick up a book, go on the internet, look up, stages of development, look up stages of emotional development, look at how we develop morally and ethical standards. Look at how children form attachments and how they model behavior. Look at what happens in adolescence. Like, there's so much to learn. And if you're not clear on what's to be expected at each stage, you may actually parent inappropriately because your child is just doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing at that stage, like adolescents experiment and they're reckless. So it's really important for parents to be there. And what happens, like here, a lot of parents take their hands off the wheel and say, well, they want to do their own thing. Let them do it. And that's absolutely not the right response. So educate yourself.
And of course the child. And the last quote unquote tip that you mentioned earlier was the whole idea of making sure that the punishment is appropriate.
Right.
Or to
The discipline.
The discipline.
Right. And discipline is not always punishment. So again, educate yourself. What are the types of discipline? And I think it's going to help when you find out the stages of development of children and what's to be expected at each stage. It's going to help it to know that so that you can be appropriate in how you discipline your children. Again, sometimes discipline looks like sitting down and having a conversation and helping that child understand what's actually happening.
This is obviously a topic that we will.
Yeah.
We're basically scratching the surface, so to speak. But
we're just blowing on the surface.
But as usual, it was a pleasure. And for those of you who joined us for this podcast, thank you so much. We appreciate the feedback. And once again, this was Making It Last, strengthening the ties that bind, just helping all of us to have better relationships. Until next time, I'm Noreen Daly.
And I'm Eva Forde.
Bye-bye.
You loving me, I loving you. Mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, sisters and brothers, friends for life, won't live in the past. All I wanna do now is making it last. Mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, friends forever, strengthening the ties that keep us together. Mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, friends forever, strengthening the ties that keep us together.